Welcome, everyone. My name is Pat McCann. I'm a research analyst here with Noble Capital Markets. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Immunic Therapeutics. Now, before we get started, I just want to mention that we will be doing Q&A at the end. So feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we will go over as many of those as we can, time permitting. So without further ado, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for the ability to speak here at the conference. And before going into the details here, please consider our cautionary notes regarding forward-looking statements during the presentation. So we at Immunic, we focus on developing oral drugs for treating chronic inflammatory and autoimmune diseases with high unmet medical need. And to be more concrete, we have 3 assets in development. 2 of those are at clinical stage. And today I will introduce to you Vidofludimus calcium and IMU-856 in more detail. Vidofludimus calcium is a quite unique Nurr1 activator and DHODH inhibitor, which is currently tested in a pair of phase 3 clinical trials, the ENSURE trials in relapsing MS, and also actively tested in a phase 2b big study in progressive MS patients, the so-called CALIBR study. And let me dig a little bit more into that, why Vidofludimus calcium is a unique asset and targeted to elevate the standard of care for the full spectrum of multiple sclerosis patients. And maybe important here is to start with what is needed. What is the remaining medical need in the area of multiple sclerosis? And this is true for all kinds of MS patients. So the big problem is that patients over time are progressing, are worsening on the disability scale you see here. And since this is a lifelong disease, it doesn't go away. It requires decades of therapy. Our goal with Vidofludimus calcium is to prevent and slow down disability worsening for the patients. And despite there are a couple of drugs approved for relapsing, specifically for relapsing multiple sclerosis, we learned recently from science and from academic research that a major portion or the major portion of disability in MS patients is coming from processes which are independent of relapse activity, so-called PIRA. And current treatments targeting relapses are more focusing on slowing down or preventing reset-associated worsening. So half of the job is not done, and this smoldering disease, which includes neurodegeneration and is now called PIRA, is something we also want to address with Vidofludimus calcium. And we're doing that because the drug combines quite some unique features. On top of the known and already proven, in phase 2 studies, proven anti-inflammatory effect of the drug, it also has antiviral effects, namely preventing reactivation of EBV, for example, but also has shown now hints of neuroprotection, which we believe is extremely important and helpful in treating that in relapse-independent progression. On top of this, Vidofludimus calcium was shown really to be very well tolerated in patients and to be safe. As I said, we have found the drug in the clinical studies to have signals of neuroprotection from the clinical side. Now, also last year, we found and we published in Journal of Medical Chemistry that Vidofludimus calcium is a potent Nurr1 activator. And Nurr1 is a protein which is known to protect neurons from cell death. Therefore, this goes beyond the normal anti-inflammatory activity. And this comes on top of the inhibition of so-called DHODH protein, which is responsible for the very selective anti-inflammatory effects of the drug and also of the antiviral effects and preventing reactivation, for example, of Epstein-Barr virus. Now jumping to the clinical side. So in several clinical trials, we have shown the drug is super safe, but also efficacious. And here, what you see here is the summary of the primary endpoint data from our phase 2 study in relapsing MS patients the so-called emphasis study. In this study, we have shown that the drug at 30 and 45 milligram is very good in reducing the so-called MRI lesions in MS patients, which is done in MRI imaging, and with very high statistical significance achieved on this primary endpoint of the study. Quite amazing results here for the inflammatory endpoints. So these things are usually correlated, as we know, with relapses in patients. But what we also found, and this goes beyond the usual, is that there is a dose-dependent reduction of so-called NFL. NFL, neurofilament light chain, is a biomarker which is originating from the structure of neurons, and it's a protein which is disseminating, and we can measure it in the bloodstream. So it's a marker of the level of neurodegeneration, and we can reduce it in a dose-dependent fashion by using Vidofludimus. So this was a sign which is, this comes on top and goes a little bit away from the normal pattern we have seen for the anti-inflammatory activity. And when we then look deeper into clinical results on disability worsening, we have seen a tremendous good effect of the drug in the 24-week blinded treatment period of the emphasis study, where in the treated patients, the rate of confirmed disability worsening was halved compared to placebo. That was interesting. And looking further and comparing that for the 2-year follow-up period, we have found that Vidofludimus calcium in a 2-year period in the open label extension of the emphasis study was only 5.8%. And this was substantially lower than what is known and found in literature from other studies testing drugs for the same endpoint in the same time. For example, here mentioned Aubagio, Ocrevus, Kesimpta, and Ponvory. So that made us interested in, we have something which goes beyond the usual and looks like we can really very nicely protect patients from disability worsening. And as part of that, we also decided to go further, not only in relapsing MS, but also to test in patients which don't have relapses. And these are patients with the progressive form of MS, PMS. And what is unfortunate for PMS patients, that for the majority of patients, there is no treatment available. There's one treatment approved here, which is Ocrevus for primary progressive, and there's no treatment available right now for patients with secondary progressive MS. In this study, we are testing 45 milligram of Vidofludimus calcium against placebo, and we are measuring the disability worsening and other endpoints. For example, the primary endpoint of the study is brain atrophy or brain volume change after 120 weeks. And luckily, we did a small interim analysis after 24 weeks of the study when half of the patients reached 24 weeks. And here is a little bit of a distribution of patients. So 60% of the patients have so-called non-inflammatory or NA secondary progressive MS, 32% have primary progressive, and only 8% have inflammatory secondary progressive MS. And what we found was amazing. So we have seen despite early and only half of the patients tested, a statistically significant reduction of NFL of the 45 milligram versus placebo. And what is a positive surprise here is that also patients with these non-inflammatory forms of MS that show a very nice benefit for the treated patients compared with the placebo group. Specifically, if you compare that with the best things so far done in that indication, on the left, you see the NFL change in our study here, the interim data, 18.8% at week 24, compared with ocrelizumab or Ocrevus. And this is the data which was published recently from the oratorio approval study performed by Roche with 12.4%. So it looks that we are at least in the same ballpark here on the reduction of NFL. I think it's also better what we have here. If you look on the middle part here, it's interesting to see that if you look on one big trial done in secondary progressive patients, the so-called EXPAND study performed by Novartis, quite exciting results, and the drug was approved based on that, but only for the subset of patients which had inflammatory activity remaining. And this subgroup also has shown a 21.4% reduction of NFL after 24 weeks, compared to our 43.3% for this admittedly small group of patients we had in our study with inflammatory activity. Whereas if you look on the left, on the patients with non-active SPMS or non-inflammatory SPMS, siponimod did show a only 4.4% reduction of NFL, where in our study we have seen already a 20% reduction. And this is driving our enthusiasm and also our conviction that this should also result in a clinical benefit when we read out the full study in April of next year. On top of that, the drug turned out so far in all the studies we have performed to really have a quite good and promising safety profile. And we think that's very nice for patients suffering from multiple sclerosis because it gives them a more safer and better tolerated choice in the future, and all of the typical parameters you see from other MS drugs. So what we're now doing is we're currently running the phase 3 INSURE programs. These are two identical studies testing relapsing MS patients. The primary endpoint is time to first relapse. And from that study, we expect later this year a futility interim analysis. And on the right, you see that we are completing the Caliber study. It's fully recruited, 467 patients. And we're expecting the data from this phase 2 on 45 milligram in April of 2025. And these two studies, I think, really pave the way towards approval for the drug, and also to underline the unique mode of action and the neuroprotective effect of the drug, which would hopefully also result in a first neuroprotective treatment for patients with all forms of multiple sclerosis. So in the last couple of minutes of my talk, I will also shortly highlight our second asset, IMU-856, which is a novel therapy which is targeting a broad range of GI disorders. It's a new target targeting SIRT6. And I think what is unique here is that it targets the physiological intestinal epithelial regeneration, so therefore avoiding the classical immunosuppression you see with typical GI treatments. The concept is very simple. So we want to restore a healthy gut. And by this, we want to make sure that we have, again, viable and functional active transporting epithelial layer in the gut wall. We also want to make sure we reestablish the proper barrier function and prevent antigens and microbiome and so forth to see directly the immune system, which then may give rise to inflammation and autoimmune diseases. IMU-856 is a first-in-class modulator of a protein called Sirtuin 6. And as I said, it's targeting the physiological intestinal epithelial regeneration. We have performed, as part of the phase 1, a small proof of concept study in patients with celiac disease as proof of concept. The good thing about celiac disease here is that we know the antigen, so we can give patients some gluten and trigger response there, and then can look if we, with IMU-856, are able to protect the patient and to prevent the damage from the gluten challenge in those patients. The study went on for 4 weeks. In the first 2 weeks were without gluten challenge and just either treatment or placebo to give the drug a chance to work. And then from day 14 on, we gave patients a 6 gram of gluten per day. And the outcomes were amazing. On all of the different dimensions of outcomes, we have seen good effects, and I want to share 2 of those here with you. One is the villus height. So this is the histology data we have compared here the villus height between day 0 and day 29 of the study, and we have seen a statistically significant protection of villus atrophy or villus height change by Vidofludimus calcium in both those groups. Another interesting outcome of the study was the function, so the transport function of the gut wall. And this is, for example, tested by uptake of vitamin B12 or zinc. And you see here that there's a dose proportional increase of vitamin B12 uptake and zinc uptake in this 4-week period of the trial. And this is amazing also because despite of the gluten challenge, there is an improvement of the overall signal on the uptake of those important nutrients. For us, I think it makes sense to develop the drug further in several indications, and we are currently working on concepts for clinical trials in those indications. Based on the already demonstrated proof of concept, we think we want to perform proper and also number-wise state-of-the-art phase 2 clinical studies to find the right doses, for example, for going further in those indications. In celiac disease, I think this is a high unmet medical need. There is no drug approved so far for treating celiac disease. And just in the United States, there are 2 million patients affected and diagnosed with celiac disease. And among those, around about 20 to 50% of the patients suffer from ongoing active celiac disease despite being on gluten-free diet. Another interesting indication is inflammatory bowel disease, which contains, for example, ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. And here also there's a high unmet need to lift the efficacy ceiling problem, which was seen with monotherapies so far developed. And in absence of immunosuppression for our drug, we believe that 856 is the perfect combination partner for drugs like anti-IL-23 antibodies or integrin antibodies and so forth. And another niche indication or orphan indication, which is interesting, is short bowel syndrome, where also there's the high unmet medical need, specifically in SBS patients with intestinal failure. So to summarize, Immunic has an advanced clinical pipeline with an asset in phase 3 and advanced phase 2 clinical study. The RMS phase 3 program is ongoing and will read out in 2026 and intended to provide a straightforward path towards regulatory approval. A very exciting phase 2 study ongoing in progressive MS, where Vidofludimus calcium can change the world, how we treat multiple sclerosis. And it's not just designed to corroborate the Vidofludimus neuroprotective potential, but also to solve the biggest unmet medical need in MS in general. And for 856, we have the first molecule targeting and aiming and proving a function in the intestinal barrier function side and demonstrated clinical proof of concept already in the phase 1b study. And we're excited to continue further development of that drug from now on. And to share some numbers here, also our cash runway projections. So at the end of last year, we reported 46 million of cash, plus another 80 million raised from the first tranche in a PIPE transaction in January of this year. With this, I want to conclude the study and give a little of heads up what's coming out next. So the next milestone is interim fertility analysis of the ENSURE clinical study, as I mentioned, towards end of 24, and the full readout of the ENSURE clinical trials estimated in 2026. Maybe the most important milestone is due in around about 12 months from now, which is the phase 2 clinical readout of the CALIBRE study, which could be really a game changer in the PMS therapy. And finally, IMU-856, we have a clinical phase 2 clinical trial in preparation. And just to mention once again, there's a broad applicability of that drug in several indications. And with this, I would like to conclude the presentation and thank you for listening and happy to answer a lot of questions, hopefully.
Thank you, Daniel. Our first question has to do with that phase 2 progressive MS trial. If you could just give a little bit more details on that and what that means for the company and for the progressive competitive landscape.
Yeah, I think you may have heard that there were a couple of attempts to solve the problem, and I think most of the leading companies in the MS therapy space, which is basically relapsing MS space, have started development of so-called BTK inhibitors. And just end of last year, ibrutinib read out a phase 3 study, which was not showing any difference to the comparator in the study, which was a big, I think, drawback and makes us all believe that the BTK inhibitors likely are not the final solution for neither RMS nor progressive MS. So that was an important thing which was happening last year. And now, since we have completely recruited the study and the study will read out in a year from now, we're talking about a market where there's really little competition in development right now. And it's a market of the size of a couple of billion. Basically, we believe this could be not only a game changer for the patients, but also for the company. I think a huge value step up potential for the company.
Great. And then our next question is asking you to give an update on the balance sheet and the February announcement of 44 million shares to be sold. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that need to be seen in the context of the PIPE transaction we have done in January. I think it is important for biotech. It's important to gain value, and for this you need to complete the clinical study and you need the funding for that. And in that context, we were able to convince good investors in the first week of January to do a PIPE transaction. And as part of that, it's a tranche deal with up to 240 million raised. And for the second and third tranche, I think we just needed to make sure we have enough shares available to get them out to the investors.
Great. And then maybe a follow-up to that would be what is your cash burn? And then with that, how do you see your funding position going forward?
Yeah, I think, as I said, the current money brings us into the third quarter of 25. So wide enough beyond the phase 2 readout in progressive MS, so that the current situation is pretty good for that. And there's the potential to also get the second tranche then triggered. So the release of the data of the phase 2 study can trigger the release of the second tranche, which would be another 80 million, depending on some other terms, of course, for example, share price dependent. So all in all, we don't give guidance on the cash burn per month, but I think we give guidance on the cash reach, which is aggregated in our whole budget planning. So the current projection is that the actual funding with the money we have brings us into the third quarter of 2025.
Great. And then our next question is regarding the progressive MS treatment. What are the, and of course what are the side effects?
Well, luckily there's
I'm sorry, if you could also touch on what the typical side effects are for other treatments and how you compare.
I think for progressive MS, the problem is there's only one drug approved, which is Ocrevus. So it's basically the side effects of Ocrevus as a pretty good CD20 inhibitor, and therefore it leads to depletion of B cells, and that automatically includes that you increase dramatically the risk of infections in patients. If you have a complete depletion of B cells, that's usually not a problem on the short term, but on the long run, it's a problem. And therefore, there are a lot of side effects associated to that immune effect of anti-CD20 inhibitors. If you look on RMS, it's a little bit more, it's a broader range of things there, and you have some oral drugs as well there. There's no oral drug in progressive MS. I think the typical effect you see is if most of the drugs are immune modulators, so they in an unspecific way downregulate the immune system, and that has intrinsically effects like infection risk increase. This could be viral and bacterial infections. You see some of the molecules have chemotherapy-like symptoms. Some liver toxicities are known for some drugs. Others include effects on the hematopoietic system, so neutropenia, lymphopenia, and all of these things. And therefore, I had this one slide where I've shown on all of these parameters that our drug is not showing any issues so far in development. And we have really treated more than 1,000 patients meanwhile with a drug. So this is really something where we believe our drug stands out of the crowd on the safety pretty nicely.
Great. And I think we have time for one more question. We do have one that came in about something I think you mentioned at the end of your slides, which is what are the milestones investors should look for over the next 12 to 18 months?
I think really, this was coming back to your first question, the key milestone is the PMS phase 2 data. I think that could be a game changer. And I think the good thing is if you look on our full company deck, which you can download from our homepage, there's also the full interim data from last October on the NFL. And there's also the link in literature that NFL is predictive of future disability outcomes. So we think that already we have shown that there is a likely positive outcome. Nobody can guarantee, but I think based on the biomarker, we are very optimistic on getting a positive readout from the PMS study, which is due in next April. So this is definitely the most important milestone. On the other hand, I mentioned the 856 and all the broad potential there. We're currently, and this was triggered by the phase 1b clinical data basically last year, but also continuing our work on potential indications. We are also discussing with potential partners, but also finding additional sources of financing for that to really make sure we have a potential broad financing of IMU-856 in several indications, because it deserves it. It's a really pretty cool new mode of action, and time is important as well. And I think that's something we also maybe potentially we can get some news flow from that during this year.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. And Daniel, thank you for presenting. We enjoyed having you.
Yeah, thank you, Pat.